just want to tell you a little bit about Brake and why we're running this webinar for those of you who haven't come across us before. We're a national road safety charity here in New Zealand, and we launched in 2011. We're also part of the international charity Brake, which was founded in the UK in 1995 and celebrating its 20th birthday this year. And we have two key objectives as a charity: preventing road deaths and injuries through educational initiatives and supporting people that have been affected by crashes through our support services. One of our key target audiences is at-work drivers, and we reach them through fleet managers, driver trainers, health and safety professionals, anyone who has responsibility for managing them in the workplace. Our initiatives in this area include our Brake professional service for fleet and road safety professionals around the world, which provides best practice guidance, research and other resources to help you manage your road risk. And I'll give you a bit more information on that later at the end of the webinar on how you can become a member of Brake Professional. We also run other initiatives for communities, educators and other audiences, including National Road Safety Week every May, which is for everybody to get involved in road safety. And on the support side of our work, we provide free support books for children and adults who've been bereaved in crashes, which can be ordered by contacting us. And we're also fundraising to provide more free support services for people who've been affected by crashes. So on to our first speaker today. I'm delighted to introduce James Angus from WorkSafe. James is a warranted health and safety inspector with health and safety experience with the regulator and private industry over the last 7 years. He's currently assessment manager for the Auckland North area, managing a team of health and safety inspectors working in high-risk areas such as construction, forestry, manufacturing and agriculture. His background includes operational and maintenance roles within the chemical industry in the UK before moving to New Zealand in 2006, where he became more directly involved with health and safety practice in the workplace. So I'm just going to switch over to James now and unmute him, so this just takes a moment or two. Okay, can you hear me, James?
Yep, I've got you. Thanks, Caroline.
Great, and we can hear you as well, so that's great. I will just make you the presenter so that we can see your slides. And
Cool,
we'll
thanks.
get started. Okay, so that should come up on your screen.
Cool, is that up?
Yes, that's great. We've got your slides up now.
Great.
Thanks.
Cool, thanks very much, Caroline. Yeah, James Angus, Assistant Manager, WorkSafe New Zealand. I just quickly want to just talk about WorkSafe in general, and then the role of WorkSafe in a more of a traffic accident scene or on the road, in jurisdiction on the road. Then I'll get into some of the key principles of the new legislation and touch on a bit of background, and then go into some of the definitions. My presentation will be out after this, so don't be worried if you miss a couple of points. There's a few speakers' notes in there, so you can kind of get the gist of it. So WorkSafe is the regulator for workplace health and safety in New Zealand. Really came about after the Pike River inquiry and the task force report, and our role is really to administer the workplace health and safety legislation, to educate workplaces, companies, employers, and to also enforce the legislation if required. There's multiple other agencies that do this role in different circumstances as well. You've got the CVRU police, who would have jurisdiction more on the road, civil aviation for civil aircraft, things like that. For accidents on the road, WorkSafe would always have an interest because it is a workplace. However, would always take a kind of secondary role to police, who would take the lead, and we would assist them in their inquiries and make sure it's investigated fully, but it'd be more of an assist role. So into the key principles of the reform bill. So why do we need the new law? So basically 75 people die every year on the job in New Zealand, and it's looking around the world, it's quite significant numbers compared to other countries such as Australia, UK, America. And basically far too many people die. So the new law is a catalyst to change the way people think about health and safety in New Zealand, and then hopefully it'll have the impact spreading across multiple duty holders and influence as well in New Zealand. So it's a devastating emotional toll as well as the people dying every year. Some of the figures on the screen there, 3.5 billion in costs, but a lot of the numbers there and the costs don't really touch on the emotional harm to communities and families. The independent task force report to the Pike River inquiry didn't really hold back anything when it started talking about the health and safety system in New Zealand. It used words such as appalling, unacceptable, unsustainable, and something really needed to change. So the government kind of responded to that and said, well, here's our response, the Working Safer Blueprint. And it really emphasized that everyone has a role to play. And it started to look at, well, there was no real one failure in the system. It was multiple failings across education, across the regulator's role, and duty holders not really taking the responsibility. So the new law is really going to be based on the Australian model law, a modern piece of health and safety legislation, and the bill is very closely modelled on that Australian law. So the Working Safer Blueprint really highlights the harm reduction goals and what government and business can do to come together to reduce the toll in New Zealand. So when's this going to all come into place? So the Act is currently with Parliament, not passed yet, so some of the things I'm going to talk about shortly may change, but I'm going to touch on some of the main principles that won't likely change, and still some of the key definitions that probably won't change either, but some of the detail may change before it gets passed, but there will be a 3 or 4 month period before it actually comes into force. And we're expecting around the third, fourth quarter of the year that the Act will come into force. As we've been speaking to people about the Act, people have been taking two stances really. So quite a negative stance, looking at it, well, I have a responsibility, and some have been looking at it as an opportunity to actually make a difference and actually make the changes that they've wanted to for the last little while. Identifying improvements as a business. So we're really promoting, well, what is my responsibility? How can I actually make improvements in my business? So there's some key elements to the legislation, which I'm going to touch on and go through now. So, well, the PCBU is the first one I want to touch on. So it's really a key change in how relationships are described in the legislation. So currently we have employer, employee, principal, self-employed person, all really quite old way of looking things, and in the modern day there's lots of different contractual relationships which the current legislation really doesn't reflect. So PCBU is a broad concept. It's person conducting business or undertaking. So basically, if you're involved in a transaction, in a business operation, then you likely have a responsibility as a PCBU towards workers. If we look at, it's probably easier for me to describe, well, who isn't a PCBU rather than who is. So workers in their own right have a responsibility to protect themselves and other people, but they're not PCBU. The organisation that employs the workers would be the PCBU. Volunteer organisations, associations wouldn't be PCBUs, and I'll touch on them more in a minute. And officers are not PCBUs, even though the new reform bill places positive duties on officers, which I'll touch on again shortly. Homeowners are not a PCBUs either. to protect the person down the road engaging the electrician. The electrician would be his workplace, but the homeowner wouldn't have a responsibility. So the PCBU has a primary duty of care. So everyone has a responsibility in health and safety to varying degrees, but the PCBU, the person who engages the workers, pays the workers, has influence over how they do their work. They create the risk, so they're responsible for managing it, putting steps in place to manage it. So the primary responsibility comes onto the PCBU. Also, something of interest is, and a key change, is this influenced and directed. So a PCBU will be required to look after workers it engages directly, but also workers they have influence and direction over. So a scenario might be that they engage a worker directly, pay their wages, but then they've subcontracted out some work that the PCBU has influence over and how that work's carried out. So they'll have direct responsibilities to make sure that that work's carried out safely and putting those steps in place. They've also got a duty to other people in the workplace as well. So people gaining works experience, visitors, and the like. Currently, we have the test called All Practicable Steps. There's going to be a change in new legislation to so far as reasonably practicable. And not too dissimilar, but there's one key fundamental thing, that cost has to be a final consideration, and it's spelt out in the Act that way, that you've got to consider whether it's a reasonably practicable step, taking into account the severity, what's known, the availability of it, and the last consideration is cost. And that cost has got to be grossly disproportionate to the risk. So if it's a really high risk situation, yeah, cost has got to be grossly disproportionate. And if you think about a fatal situation, a fatal risk, then can you put a cost on that? So the last consideration that needs to be made. Really important to emphasize around upstream activities under the new Act. So the Reform Bill looks at placing a lot more emphasis and responsibilities on people up the supply chain, so people who manufacture items of plant, design plant, suppliers, importers, installers. So that there'll still be PCBUs in that, but if they design something aware that can't be operated safely, then they've got that direct duty to actually make sure it does get made safely and designed safely and manufactured safely. So this has created a lot of discussion in industries because it'll help conversations happen that potentially people are struggling with now around the downstream being affected by the upstream. So the upstream activities and the people who supply your plant and machinery really have a responsibility to make sure it is fit for purpose and safe for its end use. Where multiple PCBUs might be operating, there's also a responsibility for them to actually talk to each other and consult. They've got overlapping duties in certain situations. Some person PCBU might have an influence over parts of the workplace where another PCBU might have influence over the rest. So they really have to talk to each other and what their overlapping duties may be. And there'll be a direct reference to this in the legislation that PCBUs have got to cooperate and coordinate together in the interests of health and safety. Overlapping and shared duties. So there's a simple example I'm putting up on the screen around a house build, and you'll be able to think of your own scenarios that will fit your own workplace, that you've got multiple trades, multiple contractors on a site or in a workplace, and they've really got overlapping duties to keep each other safe and the people safe on site. So having those discussions around, well, what will work best to protect each other, and it's real emphasis on contracting in. So you can't contract out your responsibilities just because there might be subcontractor down the chain. the top person, the top PCBU started those engagements, cannot just contract out and dilute their duties. In a lot of cases they'll have the influence that'll make a job be done a certain way, so they'll have even more of the responsibility. But big emphasis that you cannot contract out of your responsibilities. Think of it as contracting in. Officers of organizations and PCBUs. This is something relatively new. The old Act covered it, but the newer legislation is going to be more of a positive duty to actually have some governance around what's happening. Just as a board now will talk about finance and operations performance of the company, well, should be talking about health and safety at the same table to the same degree as well. So definition of an officer, so someone who makes decisions for a whole or a substantial part of the business. So when sitting around the table, someone who makes decisions for the business, someone who makes direction and or influence as part of the business. So those people would be officers, likely to be board members, partners, chief executives. So officers' duties is a due diligence duty, just like finance, just like performance of the company, asking the right questions to determine if the actual business is managing it. The Institute of Directors has got some really good guidance material on this that they released a couple of years ago, and they've also got fact sheets which goes into some of the questions that officers should be asking and what level of oversight should take place. And that doesn't take away from the PCBU's duties. So the differences between officer duties and PCBU duties. So the officers don't directly have a responsibility for health and safety within the business. That duty still relies or sits with the PCBU. And the two pictures on the slide that's up really, I think, tell the story well. So in a boardroom, discussing the governance of the company, direction, indicators, and then compared to the actual physical controls in the workplace. So workers and others. So employees now have got a duty to keep themselves and others safe. So workers under the new Act will have a take reasonable care to ensure their own safety and safety of others. So there's still that everyone has a role to play, and the workers have got their part to play as well. So to take reasonable care of themselves and their workmates and others in the workplace as well. Worker participation, worker engagement was another area that was really identified in the task force report, and it's an area that's going to be a lot more beefed up in the legislation. It's going to have its own set of regulations which will go into more detail describing, well, what worker participation is. There'll be guidance material that says, well, what good looks like and what companies can be doing. So it's really around engaging with workers, making sure that they have a say in health and safety and the things that they do. Have reps or committees and a reasonable chance to participate as well. And there'll be a lot of guidance around this and help in making it work. There'll be revamped training for reps later in the year into next year. That'll help reps actually have a bigger role in companies and actually bringing the worker voice to the table. So the role of health and safety reps will include representation of the staff, helping with investigations, inquiries, helping with monitoring the system, health and safety system within the company, but also talking in good faith, providing recommendations, feedback. But with that, they have some powers as well. So powers to issue provisional improvement notices, to stop work, but all in conversation with the employer and with the PCBU. So volunteer associations. So when a volunteer association doesn't employ anyone, then, or doesn't engage anyone or a worker beneath them, then they're not a PCBU. But as soon as they engage someone as a worker and start paying them, then they are a PCBU to those workers and have duties to the other people in the workplace, which would be the volunteers. Regulations and guidance. So the Act just won't come out by itself because you need some things to give it detail and give it more meaning for people to apply in the workplace. So it'll come out with a suite of regulations under the Act. So they will be general risk and workplace management, worker participation and representation, work involving hazardous substances, major hazard facilities, and work involving asbestos. So this will be the first group of regulations, and the second group likely to come online at some point next year. Guidance material under those as well. There'll be fact sheets to support definitions and some of the meanings in the legislation, good practice guidelines, and codes of practice as well to support some of the regulations and to support the industries actually applying the new legislation. So definitely won't come out by itself. And if you want to know more, you've got our WorkSafe webpage, which got some Reform Bill updates on there. I think there's 4 on that at the minute, which gives some examples and flash out some scenarios. But you can also give our contact center a ring as well, and the numbers on the slide there. Cool. Thank you very much. I'm quite happy to take some questions.
That's great. Thanks very much, James, for that. If anyone has a question, if you just type it into the question pane on your control panel, then I will put that to James. So I've got one through for you on this so far, James, to put to you.
Yeah.
Another James has asked, what happens in the volunteer organisation where you don't pay the volunteers but they're allowed to claim fuel expenses or kilometres travelled, so expense reimbursement?
Okay. It's a good question. It'd be quite difficult for me to go into the detail of it. But I would still look at, well, what are you paying there? What travel allowance? Have you got influence over how the car's maintained or the vehicle's maintained? What influence do you have over that? And I'd look at it from a point of view, well, there's legal ways of looking at things. There's social, there's moral, and just because the Act might not spell out that there's a duty to take, that there's still some maybe more social and moral reasons to put some good practice on health and safety. So if you're doing it for one part of your business and not doing it for another, then maybe that's something you want to look at. But as far as the scenario goes, I think I'd need a little bit more detail around, well, would they fit under the legislation or not? But if that PCBU be engaging workers with them as well, then there may be some steps to look at around maintenance and possibly some driver training as well. But yeah, difficult to say without the full scenario.
Yeah, so James, who's posed the question, perhaps if you want more detail or a more detailed answer, if you want to email your question or the extra detail through to me following the webinar, then I can pass it on to James and try and get a fuller answer for you.
Yeah, I'd be quite happy to give James a ring and have a further discussion.
Great, thank you for that. I think that's the only question that's come through so far, so that's all great. So we'll move on to the next speaker. Thanks very much for that.
Cool.
James,
thanks very much.
You're able to stay till the end, is that right, of the webinar?
Yep.
Any further questions?
That's fine.
That's great. So if anyone comes up with another question for James before the end, just put it through and we'll put it to James in the Q&A session right at the end. So I'll take you off being a presenter now, James. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Okay, so moving on. Next, our next speaker is Sam Moore, who is going to look at the legal implications of the new legislation and also start to look at some of the practical elements. And then following Sam, our final speakers for today includes myself covering some more of the practical measures that you can take to start to tackle road risk or to ensure best practice if you're already doing some things, how you can add to that. And also Jackie Carroll from TransLiquid, who will talk about what they're doing in their organisation already. So moving on to Sam. Sam is a senior solicitor at Meredith Connell. He's a specialist health and safety lawyer who regularly provides health and safety advice to a variety of clients, including some of New Zealand's largest public and private sector organisations. In litigation, Sam has experience of both prosecuting and defending health and safety matters, having acted for various regulators and defendants. Sam formerly worked for another specialised health and safety practice where he was part of the dedicated Pike River Royal Commission team. And while at Meredith Connell, Sam has been involved in a number of high-profile prosecutions and has delivered reform readiness programmes for a variety of organisations. So welcome, Sam. Can you hear me?
I can, Caroline. Thank you for that.
Great, and we can hear you as well. So I will make you the presenter now so we can see your slides for today. Great, they've come up now, so I'll leave you to it. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Caroline, and thanks, James, for the formal presentation. I found that quite good. So what I'm going to offer today is, unfortunately, people don't tend to want to hear about health and safety, and definitely don't want to hear from lawyers about health and safety. It becomes a bit of a double whammy. But what I can offer is the perspective of a lawyer when we're looking at the reforms and what they actually mean. Now, the problem that we get there is that it's very difficult to separate the legal components and the practical components, because the way in which you conform to the law always derives from your practices at some point. So without further ado, we've got about 20 minutes. I want to just cover off a 10-minute crash course legally and a 10-minute crash course in terms of practicality. So hopefully if you come away from this with some ideas about what you might like to consider in terms of your compliance program, then that'll be great, and I'll try not to overlap too much with what James has already said. So talking very broadly for a moment about the health and safety reform, it's been heralded as the most radical change in 20-something years. And that's certainly true, but I just want to question that with everybody for just a second. What the reform essentially does is it codifies better practice, I'll say at least good practice. So a lot of the obligations under the reform are arguably obligations under the existing law. What the reform really does is it makes it harder to avoid conforming at a best practice level. And there are two components to that really. One is WorkSafe, who, as you've heard, is a new entity. They are independent. As James mentioned, they were built with Pike River in mind, and the former regulator was criticised fairly heavily in the Pike River Royal Commission report, so WorkSafe is the new and improved. So you can really expect them to be quite proactive and ready to take action in this space. And they've also got significantly more funding than former regulators. And the proactive element is an interesting one. Already seeing in a number of industries much more top-of-the-cliff activity, so expecting more visits rather than bottom of the cliff once an issue has occurred. The other component that makes it hard to avoid best practice is the fact that the fines are going up quite dramatically actually. So under the existing regime, the maximum penalty available, maximum financial penalty is $500,000. but rarely do we ever see anything over about 100,000. They're going up to a maximum of about $3 million for most organisations, and then there are varying tiers depending on the level of offence and who is involved. But what I should probably say is for officers, the maximum is, in the current state of bill, 600,000 or 5 years in jail, I should say, and or 5 years in jail. And for workers, it's 300,000 and or 5 years in jail. Now, they're for the highest form of offending, which is reckless offending. And there are other permutations as you go down. If you're less culpable, the maximum fine becomes less. But suffice to say, they are extremely increased in terms of the risk of those fines. They remain uninsurable, and they also don't represent the entire cost of being prosecuted. Payment of reparations to any victims is commonplace, and a number of other costs which I'll go over in due course. So the purpose of this slide really is to just highlight that the reform, as it looks at present, that what we're looking at is going to select committee, and it's supposed to be coming back fairly shortly, is merely a codification of what people ought to be doing now anyway. So you can take my comments to be equally as applicable. So when does it apply and how? So just want to reiterate what James said previously. At a very broad level, it applies to everybody. Everybody has a responsibility if they're at a place of work. There are a few questions that can be asked that can help to clarify what the particular obligations are in a given context. They sometimes affect the legal situation and sometimes don't, but I'm just going to throw them out there so that people can consider how this might impact their organisations and start to ask the right questions. The first thing is working out the types of vehicles and whether something actually is a road or not. And so often we think of our fleets and our on-road scenarios, but a great number of prosecutions occur with mobile plant and off-road scenarios. Also, what I actually find a fair amount of clients come and ask, is this actually a road for the purpose of the Land Transport Act? Obviously that makes little difference in terms of a prosecution for health and safety, but what it does do is it tells you what your legal obligations are elsewhere. So for instance, whether somebody has to have a certain class of license, and that will affect your liability when it comes to health and safety. So that's the first thing to bear in mind, is just to be aware that your road risks are greater than just your fleet that are on a highway and so on and so forth. So the second thing there is ownership. A lot of organisations are looking at whether there's any impact on people providing their own personal vehicle as opposed to a company vehicle. Essentially, and as I say, this is in broad terms, the standard answer to that is that you have the same standards if they're at a place of work, if they're there for work, the same legal standards apply. Your driving safe policy should apply equally. The only difference really is what is practicable in those circumstances. And that really comes down to the level of control that you can exercise over that person's vehicle. Now, the definition of the place of work under the Reform Bill obviously hasn't been tested in the courts and is due to come back from Select Committee, but it is slightly broader than the existing definition. And where that comes in is this third point, vehicle use. So as a general point, it's commonly considered that you are at work, let's say if you are conducting business, so you're travelling from one location to another, but if you're commuting to work, there is a level of ambiguity as to whether you're at work or not. That's something that's fairly well argued. Again, it comes down to particular circumstances, but certainly if you're driving to work in your own car, pick up a company vehicle at work and then drive on from there, that type of commuting is not considered at work. However, the definition under the new Health and Safety Reform Bill could potentially include people who are in company vehicles but are commuting. So that's something that we as lawyers are keeping an eye out for, but that hasn't been decided yet. So I'll move on into types of duty holders. As James said, the PCBU holds the primary duty. Workers also owe duties, and so do volunteers to some extent, although you get various permutations of responsibilities with volunteers. So that's again something to keep an eye out for when Select Committee come back. I try not to repeat James too much, so he's covered that a fair degree. Who the duty is owed to, well, again, speaking broadly, the impact of the bill is to reduce harm, so it's owed to workers, volunteers and others. So what does this all lead to? Essentially, if you are at work or at a place of work, or if your staff are, then we come back to the key tests of reasonable practicability, and the same standards apply from a legal perspective. One of the things I want to make very clear here is that harm is really not an essential element. The risk of harm is an important aspect to offending the Act, but we commonly think, oh, someone's got hurt, so I'm going to be prosecuted, and that therefore means harm is part of the offence. It's actually not. It's the practices that the PCBU, the officers or the workers undertake, and what level of risk that provides. So just moving forward. When WorkSafe get involved and when they don't, this is an interesting one. I've had a number of matters where there are overlapping agencies that have an interest. James has touched upon this as well, so I'll just give a high-level overview here. WorkSafe, to my understanding, and James will correct me if he disagrees, I'm sure, their mandate is not to protect people from all and every risk. Life is inherently risky to some degree, but they certainly are interested in situations where an organisation or individual has created an additional risk, and to make sure that that organisation or individual put in appropriate measures around that. So I've just got 4 categories here to give an indication of when it might be a higher compliance risk for you as an organisation. So one is location and vehicle type. I've already mentioned the difference with, let's say, mobile plant and off-road vehicles. There's a greater degree of control over the environment in those cases, and so I would anticipate a greater degree of interest. I've got some examples of cases here and just very loose indication of costs for people. So this was a case of a mobile plant injury where somebody, I believe they ran over their foot, and it was a $37,000 penalty for that organisation. The second factor is really the environment. So again, coming back to this idea that we can't just consider our fleet on road in isolation. We should look at things like signage, traffic management barriers, loading stations, that sort of thing. In fact, I've typically seen more prosecutions in relation to these items than I actually do in terms of the drivers. So an example here, we've got Department of Labour and Carter-Holt-Harvey. This resulted in a penalty of $94,000. One of the practicable steps was that the site had inadequate traffic management barriers or indication of lanes for forklifts moving. The third item here is the cause of the agency of a particular incident. So driver error, more often than not, unless there are any training or qualification issues or any other underlying issues with how the organisation has conducted itself, driver error is typically dealt with by the Land Transport Act. But if you have something, let's say, like fatigue, where a worker's been asked to work too many hours, then certainly it comes back to the organisation or the PCBU. Again, an example of Mangere Sawmill Limited, the driver there was not competent enough or qualified enough, and that resulted in a $30,000 fine. And then just finally a catch-all here, extra risk relating to the activities always warrant more action to be taken by a PCBU. So examples are whether is the worker alone, remote locations, they have medical conditions, are there any vehicle hazards, trapping points and so on. We'll all be aware of the Enviro waste fatality, very tragic as it was. It's not the only one of its kind, and I've also got a case here, Alpha Refuse Collections, where a gentleman had epilepsy and that resulted in his death. So these are all increased factors in terms of WorkSafe involvement. So what does this lead to? It leads to a need to have a formal system in place that generally is contained within a policy. I probably should say system rather than policy, because it's slightly broader. I've just put a few things here for your consideration. So the first one is a training regime. That's obviously fantastically important when it comes to drivers, because the level of influence that the PCBU can exert is minimal. Drivers tend to be by themselves. It goes without saying that they need to be adequately qualified. The NZTA driver check system is also interesting to make sure there are no conditions on people's licenses. That can be another thing that people can look at. As I said, the emphasis on training is important, but also an awareness of the policies and safety standards that apply to employees. Particularly so if they're using their own vehicle, often we find that they're not aware that that policy applies to them. And third point there is awareness of incident response protocols. So typically if something happens in a factory or a common workplace, you have some expertise that are called to site. It might be a health and safety manager who's given a call or whoever else. Not normally the case when you've got a traffic incident, and it may well be a workplace accident and require things like freezing of the site, depending on the circumstances. There are exceptions to freezing sites, such as if you need to alter the site to protect the safety of others, but generally it's important that people are aware of what the appropriate incident response is. Fourth item there is we're obviously exercising, dare I say it, common sense. I personally usually get a few eyebrows raised here, but I find WorkSafe to be on the whole very good at exercising common sense. They have to take into account a tailoring to drivers' needs. So age, experience, the nature of work, they will all dictate the level of training that might be required. So that's the first thing. The second thing, this is to work for your organisation, so impact on other areas of business. These three items really relate to existing systems that you may have, and how HR deals with them if it's organised under HR. So worker participation, as James has mentioned. Dismissals, whether you consider certain conduct to be serious misconduct capable of dismissal, what that means. Drug testing, another important one worth revisiting. The third item here is maintenance and minimum vehicle standards. So again, it seems fairly obvious that the standard of vehicles has to be appropriate, but often it's forgotten. Minimum safety features above and beyond the legal requirements may be something that you look at. Also the age of a vehicle. Legal requirements for vehicles with seatbelts, if they're a certain age, might not be picked up if it's a personal vehicle. Various types of PPE, so torches, any adequate supplies on remote location, beacons, that sort of thing, should be considered from time to time. It's not a typical consideration, but there are certainly exceptions to that rule. The standards of vehicles obviously have to meet the legal requirement of WAFs and registrations and that sort of thing, and that's when we come back to whether you're on a road or not and how that's affected. And then evidence of all of those things, if somebody is using their personal vehicle, how you are going to gather that evidence from people is a very important consideration. I've just put a case in here, $100,000 penalty to River Run Products for failing to service their brakes on their trucks. It was taken as a very serious grievance by the judge. They were very unhappy with this organisation. It just goes to show that naturally this is a fundamental and it has to be right. The fourth thing to consider is risk identification and hazard assessment. So there are some new focus areas and some increased areas of risk. there's an increased focus on your primary areas of risk, is what I should say. So the items I've got here, emphasis firstly on psychosocial harm, so that's bullying and mental wellness. There hasn't been a great focus on that historically, but there certainly is now. It's one of the first guidelines that WorkSafe released was in relation to bullying in the workplace. The other focus that's an evolving trend is looking at part of health and safety, excuse me, and that comes into ethical business, but it's also important in terms of mitigating sentence to show that you're a diligent employer if you were ever prosecuted. So second down on the list, safe use of protocols. So what are the minimum standard protocols that are required for the type of driving that your organisations deal with? Put a number of examples there to get you thinking. Alcohol, fatigue, again working alone, any hazardous types of driving, how that affects what you undertake, whether you're likely to have passengers. I have some clients that regularly drive people who are mentally unwell. That impacts them to a fair degree. Whether you're going to allow smoking in work vehicles and whether that changes in terms of personal vehicles. And what are their obligations, if any, if you're expecting people to be towing, particularly in the case of your standard worker scenario using their own vehicle. Finally, on the end of that, we've got contractor management. Contractor management goes back to what James was indicating earlier about the obligations on PCBUs to coordinate, cooperate, and effectively to collaborate. The word I believe is communicate, but it's all a collaboration mechanism between organisations so that we don't find ourselves with an incident with organisations pointing on another. So just finally, how to achieve buy-in within your organisation. Naturally, the first and foremost is what James mentioned at the beginning of his slides, the emotional impact. The impact on New Zealand is massive. We all know that. So in order to bolster that, emphasis on the health and safety reforms impact on officers, so on the decision makers within your organisations, the fact that they are personally liable for both imprisonment and uninsurable fines. Emphasis that the cost is actually more than fines and reparations. If you outline the list, you have to provide it to anybody. You look at the cost of urgent improvement, you look at the impact on productivity, staff morale, recruitment, support for victims that goes beyond reparation, the impact on your performance, tendering for contracts. The list goes on, and it's quite astounding. And that leads me to my final point, which is that there's growing emphasis on good health and safety being not only ethical business, but also good business for the bottom line. And I've listed a couple of the studies below there for people to take and have a look at and bring to whoever are the decision makers if you are not the decision maker within your organisation. I think that's it from me, Caroline.
That's great. Thanks very much, Sam. That was really interesting presentation and really useful. So we'll do a quick Q&A now. If anyone has got any questions immediately for Sam, then just email them, put them through on the question pane. It would be great. So I have got one, which I will just through so far, which I'll just to you, Sam. So. Letitia has asked, in relation to the need to gather information on vehicles owned by staff personally, is it the responsibility of the employer to check the vehicle and obtain the necessary information regularly?
Yeah, that's a great question. What I'm going to do is say that it's the responsibility of the employer to make sure that it has done everything so far as reasonably practicable. I'm not going to leave it there and just give them the legal test, because that would be deeply unhelpful. But why I raise that is because it depends on the circumstances, depend on the level of risk and likelihood of harm, what ability they have to exercise obligations over that employee with that vehicle. So what I would be looking at doing at a bare minimum is firstly ensuring that staff are aware of their obligations and are aware of the standards and are validating that those standards have been met. I would secondly be looking for some documentary evidence to back that up. I realise that we can always draw this out to the nth degree, so that's why I say all of this with hesitation, because it doesn't translate for some people's businesses, but I would certainly feel more comfortable if a client has actually cited that documentation. I would expect then that it would depend on the level that a particular organisation had deemed necessary. So you're citing registration, you're citing driver's licences, you're citing warrants of fitness, you're potentially having an assessment undertaken if there's a need to do so. You're getting an employee to confirm that it conforms with the standards. So you are having to take a level of responsibility as a primary duty holder.
Yeah, so Brake recommends as best practice, and you can give me your view on this, Sam, too, that companies check driver licenses, whether it's themselves or whether it's through a TA license check or another company that does it for you, and also cites the warrant of fitness and registration on an annual basis to check that things are current, and also that you raise awareness with drivers as well. One of the useful things to do is to raise awareness with them about how to undertake basic vehicle checks themselves anyway, in relation to the key things on the vehicle, like your tyres, your lights, checking your lights are working, oil and water levels, of that which are you basic vehicle checks that are essential to do anyway on a vehicle on a regular basis.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that, and I would say that part of the employee's acknowledgement of the vehicle safety would be to make sure that they can inform an employer if an issue occurs that creates a hazard. So you may well have your warrant of fitness, but if you're aware that there's a crack in your windscreen that you haven't dealt with, that's something worth requiring your employees to raise with you. And so that ties into Brake's recommendation that they are aware of those various checks that need to be undertaken.
Yeah, that also leads into another question here from Jason. Actually, would you recommend employers make employees inform them of all infringements and offences, whether you load them to a hazard register or record them in another way?
That's an interesting one. Would we recommend, so the question is, would we recommend seeking a record of all infringement offences from employees who are driving vehicles? Is that right?
Yeah, well, the question is, would you recommend that employers make employees inform them? So whether that's written into their employment contract, which I know it is for some companies, that employees should inform their employer if they receive an infringement or a driving offence.
What I would suggest is that certainly in relation to serious offences, so for instance alcohol-related offences, reckless driving offences, that sort of thing, absolutely yes. In relation to the most minor infringements that people might have in terms of perhaps failure to have an adequate registration on an unrelated vehicle or parking offences, I'd say that's probably not relevant. Then everyone's going to be thinking, well, what about speeding tickets? I would probably feel comfortable myself if there was, I don't think I would require everything to be disclosed, but certainly if they reached a certain number of points that would put their licence in jeopardy, then I would expect that to be disclosed. And the reason for that is that if you are deemed safe to drive on the roads by one legislative regime and by New Zealand police, it's very difficult to then be prosecuted for failing to meet that standard. If you wanted to really push best practice and if there was particular hazards involved, there'd be nothing stopping you from declaring speeding tickets. But I tend to find that a lot of organisations want to find a balance between everything that they could possibly do in best practice to defining best practice in terms of where they sit comfortably. You know, I'm sure James will be questioning whether that actually is best practice, but that would be my answer to it.
Okay, thanks for that. Another question here is, do you think there will be any responsibility on the PCBU if a worker is driving a company vehicle, but obviously not on time, not as part of work duties, and transporting their family in that vehicle? If there was an incident, is the PCBU liable?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. The definition of a place of work is, as we said, still with Select Committee, but it's broader than as it currently stands, and it includes places which the employer exerts a substantial influence over. So I would say that it is at least arguable that if it's a company vehicle and an incident occurred, let's say as a result of inadequate maintenance, then the employer could find themselves liable in the future. I wouldn't want to say either way what the outcome would be, but I would certainly be worried about that. But yeah, that's a difficult one. They wouldn't be there for gain or reward, so it gets a little bit into a legal debate as to what the wording means, and I don't think that's been tested in the courts before. James can chime in here if he's got an alternative view, but I would.
If James wants to add anything to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Sam, you described it well. It'd be a question whether the Act would apply or not, but also what the PCBU could control. So definitely the maintenance of the vehicle. They should be maintaining it fit for its safer use anywhere, whether it's on private time or work time. It is kind of, we're not maintaining it one day, maintaining it the next. It's just need to maintain it good for good use. But definitely a question of whether the Act would apply. But definitely around the things that the PCBU could control around maintenance, that should be something that's taken care of anyway.
Okay, thanks for that. And thanks, Sam, as well. There's a couple of other questions that have come through as well, but I will just leave those to the end because it might also be useful to get the input of the other speakers too at the end of the session. So we'll leave those to the Q&A session right at the end. So thanks for your presentation, Sam. That was really useful.
Thanks, Caroline.
And you're able to stay around till the end as well, is that right?
That's right.
Great. Okay. Okay, so moving on. The next session I'm just going to touch on some other practical measures that you can do to tackle road risk. So far we've heard about the proposed reforms and who and what is covered in relation to at-work drivers, and also Sam talked about the safe driving policy side of things as well. So I'm just going to go a little bit beyond what Sam's talked about so far and look at going beyond compliance with health and safety regulations into best practice and suggestions on that area, and also where you can get some other tools and resources to help with that. So getting support for improving fleet safety at a senior level can be a challenge, but it's really crucial to make sure that you have buy-in from the top first and foremost, which, as Sam gave in the last presentation, a few examples and things that you can use to help put that case to senior managers and decision makers if that's not you. There are three key areas to highlight when building a business case for fleet safety. One is saving money, the second is legal compliance, and also social and moral responsibility, which James was touching on earlier as well. So investing in fleet safety can save you much more money in the long run. After a collision, the costs to an organisation include things like increased insurance premiums, vehicle downtime, lost productivity, employee sick leave, damage to lost stock or missed sales, and also damage to reputation. So the total cost of a fleet insurance claim following a collision has been estimated at up to 36 times the cost of repairing the vehicle involved. It's what we call the true cost of collisions. So they're much higher than simply the repairs that you're making to the vehicle. So we've talked about legal compliance already, so I won't cover that bit, but also organisations have a moral and social responsibility towards their employees and also the wider communities in which they operate. So even minor incidents can have many consequences to businesses. If someone is killed or seriously injured in a crash, the effects are not only devastating to everyone involved, but also the damage to your reputation is potentially irreparable. So gaining management support is essential, and once you've gained that support, maintaining it and utilising it is also necessary. So ensure that all employees, including senior staff, are following the same fleet safety policies and procedures, such as undertaking licence checks and risk assessments. And this helps to maintain a strong fleet safety culture across your whole organisation. Reporting and recording the extent and causes of incidents involving staff who are driving for work helps you to make informed decisions about the most effective and efficient ways to manage risk. And that includes bumps, scrapes and near misses, not just more serious incidents or incidents that require repairs, but also things that may have been something more serious. Drivers need to understand the importance of reporting all incidents and be aware of your reporting procedures. And this should be communicated to drivers through different routes that you can take, such as inductions, training, and also documentation in a driver handbook is a really useful way of putting that information across. Drivers should be interviewed following serious incidents, which help you to determine why it occurred, how it could have been avoided, and if the driver needs more intervention, for example, refresher training. And incident reports should be reviewed regularly, for example, monthly or quarterly, depending on the size of your organisation and the number of incidents that you have, to identify trends. For example, if you've got frequent late night collisions, that could indicate that driver schedules might need looking at, so drivers are not completing journeys when they're tired if fatigue is an issue. And if you employ a fleet management company or lease your vehicles, those companies should be able to help you analyse the data or analyse that data that they collect for you and help you to identify those trends and identify particular drivers who might need some additional training. It can also be useful to measure your fleet safety record against other fleets of a similar size and type. You can make use of the free 10-question fleet safety gap analysis, which is provided by Interactive Driving Systems in partnership with Brake. Some of you might have used that already, but a link to it will be included in the guidance report and the information from this webinar, so you can access it. It's free, it's just a short questionnaire, which then allows you to answer some questions, and you receive feedback on your results alongside anonymous benchmarking data. And we also carry out an annual survey of fleet operators around the world, showing how many companies have different fleet safety policies and practices in place, and sharing practice. Effective collision reporting and regular review of the data can demonstrate the impact that your fleet safety work is having, and also help you to highlight any areas for improvement. And another good way of helping is annual employee surveys, which can be used to measure changing attitudes towards safety when you've put measures in place, and assess whether the organisation's road safety culture extends to all employees. It's estimated that up to 95% of crashes are down to driver error, so it's vital that anyone who's driving on work purposes understands the importance of safety, and simple steps are expected to take to protect themselves and others. Effective regular communication is essential to get across that safety is paramount, and a driver handbook, as I mentioned earlier, is a good starting point for this and can be issued to all drivers when they start working for you, to explain the importance of driving safely and what's expected when they're at the wheel on company time. These handbooks you should keep up to date and require drivers to read them when they start, and also at regular intervals, or send out reminders about some of the things that are contained in the driver handbook through your other communications staff to keep the messages going. You can also promote other road safety messages through things like your intranet, email signatures, on wage slips, using other internal communications, and reinforce them through face-to-face team meetings, health and safety briefings, any other routes that can help to remind drivers of those road safety messages throughout their working day. Posters can also be used to communicate messages, and you can include electronic versions on your intranet or desktop or staff bulletin, alongside comments and articles on different road safety topics too. New employees' driving standards should be assessed on recruitment, so this could include a brief test of their knowledge of the road code, assessment of their attitudes to safe driving, either through a standard interview or through psychometric testing, checking that their licence is clean, as we've said earlier in Sam's presentation, and checking for health conditions that could affect their driving as well, such as sleep apnea or visual impairments. You could also include practical skills assessments at this stage or during a probationary period of employment. And assessments should be repeated for drivers on a regular basis to keep drivers' knowledge and skills up to date and identify any who might need some further training in particular areas. And drivers should also be put through a reassessment if they've been involved in a crash or are reassigned to different duties that involve a different type of driving or different vehicle, or are returning from a career break or lengthy sick leave as well. And those who fail those assessments should be taken off driving duty and then referred to relevant services or given targeted training so that it brings them back up to the standard that you're looking for your drivers. New drivers should get training as part of their induction, and additional training provided for drivers who are falling below the standard that you require, or those who are assessed as medium or high risk, for example those who have a high annual kilometre rate that they travel, or previous involvement in crashes. And monitoring drivers and analysing crash statistics will identify which drivers need additional training and how you can target this. So training should focus on things like defensive driving and safe attitudes, things like the SAFED course, safe and fuel efficient driving, are really good courses to be involved in. And organisations who don't have internal expertise on safe driver training should consider using external organisations to do your assessments and training to ensure that that training is of a high standard. So make your new employees aware of the expectations on them to drive safely by writing it into their employment contract or volunteer agreement, and also into your disciplinary policy. And notify managers immediately of any driving convictions as well. Driver behaviour can be monitored through consistent and robust incident reporting procedures, as well as spot checks wherever you can possibly do those. And fleet managers, or those responsible for the at-work drivers, can spot check driver performance by setting aside time occasionally to join drivers on the road and observe what they're doing. And this can help identify other potential issues or improvements that you might benefit from addressing as well. Other measures like a How's My Driving sticker on vehicles so that people can report poor driving can also help to deter risky driving and identify problems. And many employers find it beneficial to introduce in-vehicle telematics as well to monitor driver behaviour alongside driver assessment and engagement. Telematics can record things like harsh braking, sharp cornering or speeding, and can reduce safety-related incidents by up to 50%. So although installing telematics does involve an initial investment, many organisations are reporting that they recoup the initial outlay in safety-related cost savings within a year of actually investing in telematics and putting it in their fleet. So on to managing your vehicles, and just a little bit on this topic. Inadequate vehicle maintenance we've covered in some of the questions earlier. Vehicle maintenance is hugely important, and inadequate maintenance can cost lives. So employers must ensure that vehicles driven for work, whether company or employee owned are well maintained, particularly safety critical components such as brakes and tyres, to protect both the drivers and also members of the public and avoid costly insurance claims and repair bills. So vehicle servicing and repairs should be carried out by qualified mechanics, and those employed in-house, if you have your own mechanics, should provide evidence of their qualifications on recruitment, but also be monitored and assessed regularly to ensure that their skills are up to date. And if you outsource your vehicle maintenance, best practice is to insist on minimum qualification standards, qualification checks and regular training for those mechanics working on your vehicles, and this you can write into maintenance contracts. Drivers obviously have the most contact with your vehicles, so can be the first to spot defects and should be trained and required to carry out simple pre-drive walk-around checks, as I mentioned earlier, before the first journey of each day, which is then something that they can also carry out on days when they're not working if they're operating a company vehicle, or also on their own vehicle, because that's a good practice as well to make sure that your own vehicle that you're driving is safe. Managers can ensure that checks are carried out by drivers by conducting spot checks on them or requiring your drivers to confirm completion by sending a standard record sheet, getting them to sign something which says they've done that pre-drive check. And if they spot any defect, however minor, make sure that they report it to you as a manager or whoever their manager is at the time. And if it's a safety critical defect, then the vehicle shouldn't be taken onto the road. It should be taken off road and in for repairs immediately. So making sure that drivers are aware that they shouldn't get behind the wheel if they don't think a vehicle's safe, and they won't be penalised for refusing to take out an unsafe vehicle, even if this disrupts the business, is really important. It's better to delay a journey than to risk lives in that respect. Sorry, it's just clicked through. Bypassed a couple of slides there. So safe and realistic journey planning helps to avoid pressures to drive faster and also fatigue. So when you're planning journeys, look at having enough time so drivers don't need to drive at excessive or inappropriate speeds, and can also take regular rest breaks as well on long journeys. And where vehicles are fitted with tachographs, regularly analyse those to ensure that drivers are taking the required breaks and aren't exceeding their maximum driving hours too, of course. So also instruct drivers that if they are delayed, they should stop and phone ahead and rearrange or cancel appointments if needed, rather than driving faster. And if they become tired, they should stop and rest and take a break. And one of the best ways to reduce road risk is to reduce overall distance travelled, which is not only beneficial to safety, but it can also help to save you money and reduce emissions. So conference calls, teleconferencing and home working can eliminate the need for many business trips. And where journeys are necessary, if you can get employees to travel by public transport if it's available, walk or cycle if it's possible, then that's great. If it is necessary to drive, then vehicle sharing is good, or combining multiple trips to the same place to avoid repeated journeys. Where frequent road travel is unavoidable, for example with delivery and logistics companies, journey planning using safe and most efficient routes possible is a good way to manage journeys and help to overcome those risks as well. So the information I've just provided looks at your drivers, vehicles and journeys, but also through the reforms we've been talking about, James was talking about subcontractors to supply chain, other aspects to it. So I just wanted to share with you a case study of Crossrail. Crossrail is a company in London which is part of Transport for London, and it was established to promote and develop transport links across the city to address the lack of capacity and the congestion on the current system. So Crossrail takes safety very seriously and has a target zero vision, and it's written into their contracts for all tiers of the supply chain, including owner-operators, that any company entering a Crossrail site, whether to work or simply deliver goods, must meet certain standards. This includes achieving bronze accreditation through the Fleet Operator Recognition Scheme. And this scheme covers all aspects of safety, fuel efficiency and vehicle emissions. And it helps operators to ensure that they're legally compliant, as well as helping to increase efficiency, reduce costs and win work. And there are also contract requirements for Crossrail around driver training, vehicle safety kits and compliance. So to date, Crossrail has directly influenced the safety of over 40,000 trucks and 14,000 vans that enter its sites. Over 8,000 truck drivers have undertaken Crossrail driver training, and over 98% of the vehicles that arrive at Crossrail sites are fully compliant with their contracts. Those vehicles that aren't compliant are turned away from the site until the safety standards are met. And all vehicles are compliance checked every time they deliver to sites. Their requirements also include safety devices to help detect cyclists and pedestrians in blind spots that should be fitted to trucks. So their work has gained them various awards, including one of our coveted Fleet Safety Awards in the UK last year. And whilst this is a really large project to use as an example, it shows that it is possible to work with your supply chain, your owner-operators and anyone else involved in your business to start to promote road safety throughout that supply chain. So to help you tackle road risk, we produce a number of tools and resources through our Brake Professional service that you can use. Our pledge is our overarching flagship campaign around safe and sustainable driving, and we have a number of resources available with reminders of those messages, such as tyre tread indicators and posters. We also regularly produce guidance reports for managers on fleet safety topics, from selling road safety to the board to tackling drink and drug driving. And we also produce advice sheets for drivers and have other resources like interactive online activities. So this is our morning after calculator, which demonstrates how long it takes for alcohol to leave your system. We also produce posters, some aimed at all drivers, some at work drivers and some at communities. And you can also order resources like bumper stickers and various other things from us. Those are all available through our Brake Professional service, which is open to fleet and road safety professionals around the world. It aims to help fleet managers to tackle road risk and share best practice in fleet and road safety. And benefits include fortnightly bulletins with road safety research and initiatives, password access to brakepro.org to view those guidance reports and download resources like driver advice sheets and posters. And also we run events like this webinar. So that's the end of my side of the presentation with some of those other things that you can use. I hope that was useful to you. Just bearing in mind the time, I'm going to whiz straight on to Jackie and then come back to the questions, which will also give me a chance to open the questions pane and have a look at what's come through. So I'm just going to unmute Jackie now. Hi Jackie, can you hear me?
Yes, hi Carolyn. Good.
Great, so if I switch over to making you the presenter.
Okay.
That would be great. So Jackie Carroll is Management Systems and Compliance at TransLiquid, who's going to tell us a bit about what they have done to tackle road risk within the organisation. So that should now come up on your screen, Jackie.
Hopefully,
yeah, we can
see the.
Yeah, we can see your slides now.
Okay, thanks, Carolyn, and thanks for the opportunity just to do a, I guess, very brief sort of snapshot of TransLiquid and what we do. And I believe I've got about 10 minutes, so it will be a very sort of quick overview on the company and what we do in that respect. Just a bit of background there on TransLiquid. It's a family-owned business, and it's owned myself and my partner Greg Burt operate the company, and we focus on bulk petroleum logistics, which is for the fuel industry. And we've been operating now 15 years with this current contract, and primarily with Gull New Zealand is how we started into the bulk fuel industry. And we've expanded from that, and now we actually provide part of our fleet is what we call unbranded or just TransLiquid branded, and provide delivery for all the oil company industry in New Zealand. Predominantly, we're 95% in the North Island. However, we have done deliveries to the South Island by customer demand. And typically on a year now, we're currently doing in the vicinity of about 3 million kilometres and delivering in the vicinity of about 300 million litres of fuel throughout that network. When we started this contract with Gull, we had two trucks, and that was in 2000, so in 15 years on, we've now got 16 trucks in the fleet, and we're just about to put the 17th truck on the road probably next month. We've grown in the size of the operation. We employ, there's 26 operators and 5 in the leadership team, which is the scheduling, dispatching, sort of fleet maintenance management, and included in there is our operations and sort of driver training, looking over those programs. Just the nature of what we do, we have to operate 24/7, and we provide obviously shift rotation with our fleet, servicing it sort of 365 days a year. Obviously the demands of fuels can have peaks and lows depending on seasonal or price spikes when there's fuel sales go on, so we have to have the ability to sort of meet those demands, which can be quite challenging at times. Just I guess a snapshot here of the configurations that we operate in our fleet. We only operate bulk fuel tankers, and there you can just see the quad tankers, and then there's the semi-tanker, and our latest addition has been the B-train, which meets all the requirements for the 50-tonne max legislation. So those are the configurations, and like I say, these vehicles, we operate them, probably 80% of our fleet would be double shifted, so there'd be two operators dedicated to each vehicle, and then some of the fleet being single shifted, which allows us a reasonable amount of flexibility when we're wanting to have a truck off the road for servicing and maintenance. So it's a sort of operation that works well for us. We run a 4 and 2 shift roster pattern as well. We've standardised, and a big part of I would say the success of our company is we've standardised with all Kenworth tracked units and all tanker engineering tankers. And the reason I guess I emphasise that is the fact that it's a benefit in that the operators that are driving the vehicles, they are standardised. So if they're jumping between one tracked unit to another for working or operating another tanker itself, they're familiar with what they're working with. So you haven't got that risk of them sort of unfamiliar, or it actually simplifies as well the training program, because once again standardised when we're doing the training development. And that sort of flows through a little bit too into the maintenance programs, which have already been spoken about, but we've extensive in what we do with maintenance. So we have the service providers become very familiar with our equipment, and obviously the requirement for compliance and testing, inspections and certifications is quite a high level. So having service providers that are very familiar with the equipment once again minimises any issues that might arise there. Just a bit of a touch, I guess, and all I can do is emphasise what's already been spoken about as well, because when we sort of say just the nature of the business that we do, because we are in the fuel industry, and oil companies obviously being corporate and having quite, I guess, high expectations of standard and safety requirements. So we just sort of look at the basics that have already been spoken about, which was with Sam and Carolyn in particular, is they're just part of our DNA. So a lot of those basic requirements on policies and the processes around, say, operator selection and vehicle maintenance is just common practice for us. Where we place a lot more emphasis and believe that it actually is probably critical in the I guess success of safety culture being adopted is the individual's attitude and their behaviour. And something that when we're recruiting, we believe with fuel tankers, even if we're taking on a new employee that's not driven a fuel tanker or done fuel deliveries before, we're looking for attitude of someone that might fit into our company and be receptive to sort of the rules and regulations, and not want to shortcut or challenge or that. So we can train them through our training program to operate these fuel tankers very easy to load and unload. We also need to take on board that it's don't dumb it down when you're sort of talking about safety in the culture. The employees treat them as adults. They will give you feedback on where the problems and where the concerns are. And a lot of that has already been touched on as well when you have employee engagement surveys, getting some feedback. When you have an incident, just as an example, your incident reporting process and reviewing process, the individual, for a start, usually feels extremely bad about the fact that they've had an incident, and they've usually thought, of how it can be avoided and what needs to be done and what improvements need to be in place. So we engage with them in that and ensure that we take all their input into any improvements. The point that was made about the engagement is once again very important, and it's with the transport industry, and in particular like ours, we're operating 24/7. You've got a team that don't actually have opportunities to socialise a lot, and also because you're on shift roster, may not actually see a lot of their peers very often. So you've got to become quite creative in ways that you can sort of engage them, and part of that engagement is also keep the focus on sort of safety conversations going on. So I won't deny it, we've struggled with doing this, and what we do now is we've got better at having monthly, we have them sort of barbecue days where if we set it a certain day, and then the operators that are on that day, we get the opportunity to interact and talk about safety. We also, on about 4 occasions of the year, we'll park the whole fleet up and have company meetings, and that in itself is quite challenging. But any transport company, and I mean our fleet is small, being only 16. You've got to look at ways of how you can actually hold those safety toolbox meetings that work for your organisation. The role modelling and standing clear expectations. We've put a lot of emphasis and development into our training program, so the whole induction and training process from recruiting right through to when they're able to go unsupervised. The people that you engage, your driver trainers in the organisation, must be the role models at the end of the day. They're the ones that need to be talking the company culture, talking the values, and ensuring that that's setting the standard for those new employees, and it's quite clear when they come on board. With any sort of safety programs, there is they can be extensive and as complicated as you want to make them. We've now put a lot of emphasis on identifying and focusing on what our critical risks are in the business, and I'll touch on them in a little while. And following on from that is just to be identifying and monitoring what's important. So you need to have identified some key trends in your company that might be trigger points to say that some processes or procedures are needing to be reviewed, and it needs to be about the people and not the statistics. So with that side of it there, it's about ensuring that you are staying engaged with your staff, you're out there talking with them, and it's the walk the talk and being involved. And periodically what we're also doing, as well as the driver trainer, they're doing frequent in-cab evaluations, so spending a shift in the truck with our guys, just ensuring that there isn't any issues or concerns, and that the procedures and policies are understood. The one that I want to touch on a little bit here too is being a small to medium-sized business, that we do have limited resources. So obviously organisations that are far larger and have the extensive network of all the resources, like you might have an HR person, and you might have a health and safety person, and you've got operations managers. When you're smaller, you are limited in your resources, so therefore once again it goes back to just really focusing on what is critical for your business. And with the new health and safety reform, because the focus tends to now be on risk, is you've got to have a really good understanding of what that risk is and make sure that your resources are focused on that. When we're just talking about the topic of the webinar today, which is on the health and safety reform being specific to driving, I'm just going to touch on a few, and once again limited on time to go into the detail of what we actually do in our company. And when we ask all our guys, what do you consider to be your biggest risk, and this is something that we talk about when we do our performance evaluations with them, we always ask them, what's the biggest risk for you right now at the moment. And it always comes back to it as the public, and we recognise that that is something that is to some extent outside our control. And then when we go from there, then we look at, well, what are the things that as a company we can manage and provide, improve on the safety. And it comes down into the fleet safety itself, the technology and the comfort of the vehicles that are being driven. The health and well-being, a lot more emphasis needs to be on the health and well-being of staff, fatigue management and training and development, and the TURP's transport emergency response capability. So I'll just go back and briefly touch on I think each one of those a bit more detail. With the fleet safety and technology, what we do with our fleet, there's a lot of safety features that are inherent and built into the tractors and the tankers themselves that actually provide the added safety. And without going into all of it, it's the tankers themselves. They have underrun protection that stops cars going underneath them should they be involved in an accident with a car. The tractor units themselves, they have a high standard of safety in the cab. They've got what we call active cruise braking, which if they're travelling behind a car, the sensor will detect and maintain the safe travelling distances. That device in itself has got the capability to respond faster than the driver, so if that car suddenly stopped, the whole tractor unit and tanker would come to a stop at the same time with that vehicle in front of it. So a lot of these features now are common. When we're replacing vehicles, we're always upgrading to the latest safety technology, and I think that's important, not only for the company, but it minimises the risk to the employees as well. Health and well-being is something that we have always put a lot of emphasis on. However, in the last couple of years we've stepped that up and put a more focus on what we've recognised now as nutrition, education about nutrition and fitness and just well-being. So with our guys on the road and shift work, obviously some of the choices around and on the road for finding healthy food is pretty limited. So we've done quite a few workshops on educating them on how to prepare and take healthy food with them, or if they are faced with not many options on the road, what's a better option for them to take. With that, it's covered with, it touches on what's already been spoken about, things like drug and alcohol testing, health screening, health and well monitoring, and we also provide employee assistance programs. So people's lives, every now and again, they do need to seek some counselling, some advice, and we've got that system in place and actively working. Fatigue management is something that is probably second to the public as far as the risk, is our second biggest risk when we're talking about operating a 24/7 sort of shift operations. We need to put a lot of emphasis on that. So what we've done as well as awareness is we've actually gone to the extent of doing some monitoring for 2 weeks, for example. They've worn ready bands, which has monitored their sleep and awake time, and to get an identify if we've got any at-risk people with sleep apnea, and also looking at if they've got sleep behaviour issues that they need a bit more education on. That's been valuable in the fact that we've identified some employees that have potentially sleep apnea, and we're sort of progressing down that path and working with them on that. So can't stress enough how valuable that's been. The training and development, I won't go into that because ours is so extensive, and it has been touched on. A lot of the topics that have been mentioned prior need to be incorporated in your training and development, so full supervision and ensuring that that the awareness is done there. We have a buddy training system that goes on for, depending on the individual's level when they come to the company, and you've anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks. And following the training, there's repeat in-cab evaluation, so that's constant monitoring after there as well, and that's just continuous. So it's 3 months, 6 months and 12 monthly they're getting those in-cab evaluations. The SAFED program was mentioned before. We've incorporated SAFED training as part of our company programs as well, and found it to be very effective. Touching on the transport emergency response capabilities, and that was also mentioned previously as well, as should you unfortunately be an event of an emergency situation where you've been involved in an accident, obviously with a fuel tanker that can actually be quite catastrophic. And so therefore we've got a team of there's 4 within our organisation that have been to Australia and had training on specific transport emergency response, because you're wanting to know when you're sending someone into that situation that they're obviously completely competent and capable. And the emergency response services, although, once again competent in their side of it, not necessarily have all the level of knowledge on what to do to manage those risks when they're dealing with a fuel tanker, whether it be full or empty in an emergency situation. And by having internal skills too, you're mitigating some of the risk or damage that may happen when you're actually doing the recovery process as well. I'm just going to finish off a little bit where the ACC Fleet Saver Gold program, which came into effect last year, our WSMP was up for renewal, so we also went to have a dual audit which included the Fleet Saver program, and this runs parallel with the WSMP, so all your basic health and safety processes and programs are there, and there's another couple of elements on it regarding driver training practices and management practices, as well as fleet maintenance and systems as well. So we achieved the gold status, which is the highest one at the beginning of the year. And what's fairly unique about that, I guess, is that we achieved that without GPS. So there was talk before about telemetrics and monitoring of the driver behaviour through reports. We were able to get it without that, and it was due to being able to provide good evidence of sort of a behaviour safe culture. And once again, it's got to be sort of the foundation needs to be good processes and systems and evidence to be able to demonstrate that that's happening. And when I say processes and systems, things like incidents are being reported, meetings and are happening, conversations around health and safety, all your records around your maintenance and testing and inspections and pre-trips, everything is solid in that respect. So it's showing that it's a good culture and engagement and involvement within the organisation. The communication is important, as having that very open and approachable way, so as anyone that's got any issues has the ability to come and report them and not feel the feel of fear to be able to do that. So that's quite critical. It's created by how you are reporting and also how you're reviewing these events, and that you're doing it by including all the relevant people, and that is also the employees that have been involved in the incident, so they don't feel that their opinions don't count. Big part is the celebrating and recognising achievements too. So we too often try and report and record and trend what went wrong, but don't be afraid to be looking for what everyone's doing right, and also when you have achieved amazing sort of, I guess, milestones or events, is to celebrate them or to recognise individuals that have come up with some good ideas or initiatives, and look for as many ways as possible that you can be doing that to encourage more of it. The leadership needs to be strong and actively involved, and that's obviously quite important, and especially now the changes in the reform, where that focus is more on sort of directors and higher level within the organisation. So if they're not involved, they definitely need to know what all your programs are and be seen to be participating and understanding what's going on within the organisation. Engaging staff, I've spoken about that, so I'm not going any more, but it's also, I guess, in closing, I'm just going to say that it's really important to know, specific for your organisation, what your threats and risks are. Obviously, for ours being a fuel tanker fleet dedicated to that kind of business, we're quite specific on what we know our biggest risks are, and certainly make all your programs and systems focus on those. I mean, obviously the small things to some extent are still relevant, but if you're looking after the major threats and risks, then that will sort of flow down into the smaller ones as well. I have gone very quickly, and I'm just sort of very conscious of the time, so I'm hoping that that's kind of given a real snapshot of some of the things that we're doing at Transliquid, and happy to take any specific questions.
That's great. Thank you very much for that, Jackie. That was really useful information, and that information will also be included in the slides will be circulated in the guidance report after the session as well. So anything that we want to cover a little bit further can be included in that guidance report too. So if anyone's got any further questions, I'm aware obviously of the time we've run a little bit over. I've just got a couple of questions on here that came through earlier, so I'm just going to unmute James and Sam as well. And then we'll take any further questions that people might have just before we finish as well. So I've unmuted everybody now. One comment that came through was around some of the resources, which there are some really useful resources on the fleetsafety.gov.nz website as well, which is through the Fleet Safety Programme that's run by ACC, Police, the Transport Agency and MB as a joint initiative, which if you've not been on there already, there's some really useful resources there. If you have been on there already, the Workplace Road Safety Guide is a really useful thing to use when looking at your fleet safety policies. So just back to a question from earlier from Rachel was, if a health and wellness programme is offered to employees that clearly addresses a risk in the business, for example fatigue, can an employee opt out of participating given their responsibility to participate? If that's possibly one for Sam initially.
So the question was whether an employee can opt out of a health and wellness program. Is that right?
Yeah. So if it's a program which is offered to employees that clearly addresses a specific risk, such as fatigue when you're driving, can an employee opt out?
I would say that if it addresses a particular risk like fatigue, I wouldn't refer to it as a wellness program. I'd refer to that as a safety program, because essentially it's attempting to mitigate the risk of that particular hazard. So I'd say that they shouldn't be able to opt out. In certain circumstances, I've seen that they can opt out with various clients, but I would certainly expect a workforce, if we're going to talk about best practice, I would expect a workforce to buy in, and that's where at the front end, you know, as we've heard, engaging people that are going to deal with health and safety and making sure that's part of their contract as well. I think that's a reasonable request, to be honest, as long as it doesn't go above and beyond, you know, what they do for a living. I think that's reasonable, and so I think they should adhere to it.
Great, thanks for that. Jackie or James, either of you want to add to that? Or
I can sort of make
definitely. Yeah. Go on, Jackie.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say I can make a comment. When we actually rolled out our fatigue program, which was a bit more than health and wellness, and I believe it's probably the way that it can also be communicated to staff, because we had to obviously get their consent or sign consent to want to participate in it, and we had pretty much 100% of our employees that got on board, and I think a lot of it comes down to that you have to avoid or reassure them that you're not on a witch hunt to, if we do find any problems, we're going to look at ways to terminate you. We put a lot of emphasis on the fact that it's for their own benefit and their own health and wellness, and that it's so there needs to be some sort of reassurance and mechanism here to say that it's, if we do find any issues, we will work with you through that, so in that, you know, quite clear.
that's great. Thanks, Jackie. James, did you want to add anything else onto that? I think we might have lost James temporarily, so we'll come back to him if you've got anything else to add when he comes back from that. I also just have another website and information to direct people to, which I will also include in the guidance reports that comes out following the webinar, around the CLOCS standard, which is a new standard in the UK around construction companies in relation to cycling safety and protecting cyclists in particular on the roads, which a lot of construction firms are signing up to, and that's come through from Crossrail and the Fleet Operator Recognition Scheme in the UK too. So thank you for that link, Jason. I will include that in the guidance that comes out afterwards as well. So I think that's all of the questions covered. If anyone thinks of a question afterwards that you want to ask to a particular speaker or to all the speakers in general, then just you can email it through, and we can look at getting an answer to that. So I'll just round up the webinar now as well, just with a couple of notices right before we finish. and a couple of other ways that you can get involved further. The first is that Break this year is running our first ever Australasian Fleet Safety Awards, and we've run these awards in the UK for over a decade now. These are the first ever ones that we've run in Australasia, and they recognise safety-conscious organisations for their initiatives that work to tackle road safety. All of the details for the awards are online, and I encourage you to enter and get recognition for the work that you're doing in addressing fleet safety. You can also get involved with Break by joining Break Professional, as I mentioned earlier, and we're offering webinar attendees a 50% discount on the normal rate for joining, so it's either $60 or $186 depending on your organisation. If you want to join, just tick the box on the feedback survey at the end or contact us. We also send out fortnightly bulletins with details of events and resources. Some of you signed up for this on your registration form for the events, but if you're not sure whether you did and you want to, just tick the relevant box on the feedback survey. It's also Road Safety Week in 5 weeks, the 4th to the 10th of May, and there are lots of ways for organisations to get involved and help raise awareness of road safety. You get free resources for taking part as well, so go to the Road Safety Week website and have a look at what we've got on there. And finally, we are a charity, and we rely on sponsorship from companies and fundraising and donations from individuals, communities, schools and organisations. So if you are able to make a personal donation or to fundraise for us yourself or with your workplace, it is really appreciated. We also look for companies to sponsor us as well. So you can find out more information on donating, fundraising and corporate partnership on our website, break.org.uk, or by contacting me using those details there, or you can tick the box on the feedback form. So I hope that you found the webinar useful and interesting today. Please do fill in the feedback survey when you leave the webinar. It's really useful in helping us to plan future events. And I will be circulating, as I say, the slides from today and the guidance reports on this topic very soon. So it just leaves me to say a very big thank you to all of our speakers again today. Thank you to James, Sam and Jackie for taking part in that. And finally to everybody who's joined in with the webinar today. I hope you have a great rest of the day. Thanks.
Thanks, Caroline.